Rachel Montgomery gripped the hospital bed rails as another contraction tore through her body. Her phone still warm. In her trembling hand from the text that confirmed it. $200 million, the largest deal in her company's history, signed and sealed while her husband stood in the delivery room doorway. Her pregnant belly contracted violently as she looked up at David, the man she'd built everything with, expecting to see pride. Or concern or even basic humanity. But instead his eyes were cold, distant. Already somewhere else, his fingers typing rapidly on his phone screen with a kind of urgency he'd never shown for. Their marriage. The delivery room nurse asked if he was staying, and Rachel watched her husband of 7 years, the man whose startup she'd secretly funded, whose mother's medical bills she'd quietly paid, whose failures she'd shouldered without complaint. Look at her swollen, laboring body with something close to disgust. David's mouth opened, and the words that came out would shatter the illusion Rachel had maintained for far too long. He was leaving right now to marry Vanessa, his mistress, because she deserved a man who wasn't trapped by an inconvenient pregnancy with a wife who chose her career over family. What David didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know because Rachel had hidden it so carefully, was that his pregnant wife hadn't just closed a $200 million business deal, she closed the deal that would put her in control of the very company that employed him, funded his mistress's boutique, and owned the building where he planned to start his new life. But how could a man so completely unaware of his wife's power have become so arrogant? And what would Rachel do in the moments after he abandoned her in the delivery room when she realized that the man she'd protected had never deserved her protection at all? What kind of shock would await a husband who abandoned his pregnant wife without knowing she held the keys to his entire future? The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Rachel's water broke at 3:47 p.m. Exactly 14 minutes after she'd signed the final page of the acquisition agreement that made her the majority shareholder of Meridian Tech Holdings. Her assistant, Jennifer, had been frantic on the phone, begging her to get to the hospital, but Rachel had insisted on staying for just 5 more minutes, just long enough to initial the last document that would change everything. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent the past 9 months growing a human being while simultaneously growing a business empire that would eclipse anything David had ever dreamed possible. Her husband had always called her work cute, that condescending word he used whenever she mentioned board meetings or investor calls, as if her career was some adorable hobby rather than the financial foundation their entire life rested upon. David hadn't even known she was in labor at first. He'd been at lunch with Vanessa, the 26-year-old marketing coordinator, whose Instagram was full of carefully curated photos of luxury handbags and champagne brunches, all funded by the generous salary Rachel's company paid her through their subsidiary. Rachel had discovered the affair 6 months ago when she'd seen the credit card statement showing a hotel room charged on what was supposed to be David's guy's weekend in Miami. She'd hired a private investigator, not out of jealousy, but out of strategic necessity, because Rachel Montgomery didn't make decisions based on emotion. She made them based on information. The investigator's report had been thorough. Vanessa Chen, ambitious and beautiful, had been sleeping with David for 18 months, almost the entire duration of Rachel's pregnancy. They'd been careless. Or perhaps they'd simply assumed Rachel was too busy or too pregnant or too stupid to notice. The photos showed them at restaurants Rachel couldn't afford in her early days, wearing clothes Rachel's success had indirectly purchased, planning a future they believed was theirs to claim. What the investigator had also uncovered was that Vanessa was already picking out wedding dresses, posting them in a private Pinterest board titled Mrs. Montgomery 2.0. Rachel had felt her daughter kick inside her as she reviewed those photos, and she'd made a decision that would have surprised anyone who thought they knew her. She wouldn't confront David. She wouldn't scream or cry or beg. Instead, she would watch, document, and prepare. Because Rachel had learned long ago growing up in foster care that survival required strategy, not sentiment. The little girl who'd aged out of the system at 18 with nothing but a scholarship and determination had become a woman who understood that power wasn't given. It was taken carefully and completely. The delivery room was private, expensive, the kind of medical care that Rachel's Insurance through her company provided without question. David had arrived 20 minutes after she texted him, his hair slightly mused in a way that suggested he'd been doing more than eating lunch. He'd kissed her forehead with the mechanical affection of a man going through motions, his eyes already checking his phone before he'd even asked how she was feeling. Rachel had watched him through the haze of early labor, studying the man she'd married 7 years ago in a small ceremony his mother had called premature and his friends had called lucky for him. She remembered their beginning with the clarity that pain sometimes brings. They'd met at a tech conference where David had been pitching his startup idea to anyone who would listen, a revolutionary app that would change how people communicate. Rachel, working as a junior analyst at an investment firm, had seen past the grandiose presentation to the flawed business model underneath. But she'd also seen his charm, his enthusiasm, the way he'd looked at her like she was the most fascinating person in the room. Within 6 months, they were engaged. Within a year, married. Within 2 years, Rachel had quietly invested $70,000 of her savings into his company. When no other investors would bite. David's startup had failed, as Rachel had predicted it would, but he'd never known about her investment. She'd routed it through a shell company, protecting his pride, because back then, she'd still believed that marriage meant protecting your partner from hard truths. His mother's cancer diagnosis had come next, and Rachel had anonymously paid for the experimental treatment that saved her life. Another secret kept, another sacrifice made in the name of love that had never been adequately returned. Now, as another contraction gripped her, Rachel watched David's thumbs fly across his phone screen. "Who are you texting?" she'd asked, her voice steady despite the pain radiating through her pelvis. "Just work stuff," he'd said, not even looking up. "Nothing important." But Rachel knew it was Vanessa. She knew because she'd installed monitoring software on his phone 3 months ago after she decided that knowledge was the only weapon that mattered. She'd read every text, every email, every WhatsApp message planning their future together. She'd seen him tell Vanessa that he was just waiting for the right moment to leave, that the pregnancy was an unfortunate complication, that he couldn't wait to start his real life with her. The right moment, apparently, was now. Dr. Sarah Chen, no relation to Vanessa, thank God, examined Rachel with professional efficiency while David stood awkwardly by the window, still typing. "You're at 7 centimeters, Dr. Chen announced. "We're getting close. Dad, you might want to put the phone away and get ready to meet your daughter." Rachel saw David's jaw tighten at the word dad. Saw the flash of something like resentment cross his face before he masked it with a weak smile. "Right. Of course," or he said. But he didn't move away from the window. Didn't put the phone in his pocket. Didn't take Rachel's hand the way husbands were supposed to do in movies and television shows and normal lives. Instead, his phone buzzed with an incoming call and Rachel watched him glance at the screen and then at her calculation clear in his eyes. "I need to take this," he said. "It's important. More important than your daughter being born." The words came out sharper than Rachel had intended, but pain had a way of stripping away pretense. David's face hardened. "Not everything is about you, Rachel. Some of us have responsibilities that don't involve board meetings and power lunches." The accusation stung not because it was true, but because it revealed how little he understood about what she'd built, what she'd sacrificed. Who she'd become while he'd been playing startup entrepreneur with other people's money, her money specifically, though. He'd never known it. He left the room, phone pressed to his ear, and Rachel heard him laugh in the hallway. That easy, charming laugh that had first attracted her all those years ago. Through the gap in the door, she could see him leaning against the wall, relaxed and animated in a way he never was anymore when he talked to her. The nurse, Jennifer, different from her assistant, but sharing the same name, gave Rachel a sympathetic look that said she'd seen the story before, knew how it ended, pied the laboring woman whose husband couldn't be bothered to stay present for the biggest moment of their lives. But Jennifer didn't know the whole story. Nobody did. Nobody knew that while David had been building his mediocre career at Meridian Tech Holdings, Rachel had been quietly acquiring shares through a series of carefully structured purchases. Nobody knew that the consulting work she'd been doing for the past 3 years had actually been preparing for a hostile takeover. That would put her in control of the company David worked for, Vanessa worked for, and half their social circle depended on. 8 centimeters dilated, and David still hadn't come back from his phone call. Rachel breathed through the contractions using the Lamia's techniques she'd learned from YouTube videos since David had been too busy to attend the classes with her. Her mind drifted to a memory from 6 years ago when she'd still believed in the fairy tale of their marriage. They'd been in bed, David tracing lazy circles on her stomach, talking about the future. "We'll have 3 kids," he'd said. "You can take a few years off, focus on family. I'll work my way up to executive level and we'll get that house in Westchester." Even then, Rachel had felt the quiet eraser of her own ambitions in his vision. She'd already been managing a 7-figure portfolio, already been making strategic moves that would eventually position her for the Meridian acquisition. But David had never asked about her career goals. Never wondered why she worked such long hours. Never questioned where the money came from. That supplemented his modest salary and allowed them to live in an apartment that should have been beyond their means. The door opened and Rachel's heart leaped with the stupid, stubborn hope that maybe David had come back. Maybe he'd realize what he was missing. But it was just Dr. Chen checking on her progress, making notes on her chart. "Still no dad?" she asked carefully. "He's on an important call," Rachel said. The lie automatic, protective. Even now, even knowing everything she knew, some part of her wanted to shield him from judgment. That was the curse of having loved someone. You remembered who they used to be or who you believed they were. And you grieved that person even when the reality standing before you was a stranger. Her phone buzzed on the bedside table. Jennifer, her assistant, not the nurse, had sent a message. "Deal is officially closed. Press release goes out at 5 p.m. You're officially the CEO of Meridian Tech Holdings. Congratulations, boss." Rachel read the message 3 times, letting the magnitude of it wash over her between contractions. She was now the head of a company worth $1.2 billion. She controlled the employment, benefits, and future of everyone who worked there, including her husband and his mistress. The delivery room suddenly felt smaller, hotter, as the dual reality of her situation crashed together. The most vulnerable moment of her physical life happening simultaneously with the most powerful moment of her professional life. The irony was almost poetic. Here, she was about to birth a new life, having just birthed a new corporate empire. And David, clueless David, was somewhere in this hospital, probably telling Vanessa that everything was going according to plan. 9 centimeters. The pain was becoming abstract, almost metaphysical. Rachel had read somewhere that women's bodies were designed to forget the specific sensation of childbirth, a biological mercy that allowed the species to continue. She wondered if the same was true of emotional pain. If someday she'd forget what it felt like to realize your husband was a stranger. Your marriage a performance. Your love unrequited and unworthy. David finally returned. But he wasn't alone. Rachel could hear voices in the hallway. A woman's laugh that she recognized from company events where Vanessa had played the role of sweet, ambitious employee, never betraying by look or gesture that she was sleeping with the CEO's husband. Was Vanessa here in this hospital, waiting for her moment? The audacity of it should have shocked Rachel, but she was beyond shock now. She'd been collecting evidence for months, watching the patterns, understanding that David and Vanessa weren't just having an affair. They were planning a life, a future that required Rachel to be completely removed from the picture. When David walked back in, his face was set with a determination that Rachel recognized from the business world. It was the expression people wore when they'd made an irreversible decision and were committed to following through, regardless of consequences. He approached her bed slowly and for a wild moment, Rachel thought he might apologize. Might have had some moment of clarity during his phone call. Instead, he said, "We need to talk." "I'm in labor," Rachel pointed out, which seemed obvious, but apparently needed stating. "I know, and I'm sorry about the timing. But I can't keep lying." David's voice had taken on the tone of someone who'd rehearsed the speech, probably with Vanessa coaching him, telling him he deserved happiness, that Rachel was holding him back. "I'm not happy, Rachel. I haven't been happy for a long time. You're always working, always busy with your projects." He actually made air quotes, dismissing years of work with a gesture. "Vanessa makes me feel alive again. She sees me. Really sees me. And I can't bring a child into a loveless marriage. It wouldn't be fair to anyone." The contraction that hit then was the worst yet. A physical manifestation of everything breaking inside her. Through the pain, Rachel looked at her husband, really looked at him, and saw a small man who'd always needed to be the center of attention, who'd married her when she was a junior analyst, but had grown to resent her as she'd surpassed him professionally. She saw a man who'd taken her silent support as his due, who'd spent her secret money without gratitude, who'd built his mediocre career on the foundation of her excellence without ever acknowledging the debt. "You're leaving," Rachel said flatly. "Now, while I'm in labor with your daughter, I'm leaving," David confirmed and had the audacity to look relieved that she understood. "Vanessa's waiting. We're going to Vegas tonight, getting married tomorrow. I wanted to tell you before, but there was never a good time." And then the pregnancy, and he trailed off as if the pregnancy had been something that happened to him rather than something they'd created together. Rachel's mind was operating on two levels. On one level, she was experiencing the betrayal, the abandonment, the sheer cruelty of a man leaving his wife in a delivery room. On another level, she was calculating, planning, seeing 3 moves ahead the way she always did in business. David had just made a fatal error. By leaving now, by making the abandonment this public and this cruel, he'd given her something more valuable than fidelity. He'd given her moral authority, legal ammunition, and a story that would devastate him in every possible arena. "Vanessa's here," Rachel asked. "In this hospital. She's waiting in the parking garage. We didn't want to. It seemed wrong to bring her up here." Even in his betrayal, David wanted credit for restraint, for having some minimal boundary he hadn't crossed, as if not bringing his mistress to his wife's delivery room was somehow commendable. Dr. The Chin knocked and entered before Rachel could respond. "We're ready to push," she announced, then stopped, reading the room with the skill of someone who'd presided over countless family dramas in delivery rooms. "Is everything okay?" "My husband is leaving," Rachel said clearly, loudly enough for the nurses in the hallway to hear. "He's abandoning me to marry another woman right now while I'm about to deliver our daughter." The look on Dr. Chen's face was everything. Shock, disgust, professional composure, wearing with human revulsion. She turned to David with an expression that could have frozen lava. "You need to leave," she said. "Now." But Rachel held up a hand. "Wait." She looked at David, really looked at him one last time, memorizing his face for the divorce proceedings, the custody battle, the inevitable moment when he realized what he'd lost. "Before you go, I want you to know something. That business deal I closed today, it was for Meridian Tech Holdings. I just became the majority shareholder and CEO. As of 5 p.m., I own the company you work for. I control Vanessa's employment. I control your stock options, your benefits, your entire career." She watched the color drain from his face. Watched him process what she was saying. "That's not you can't. I can. And I did." For the first time in their marriage, Rachel saw David truly see her. Not as his wife, not as the woman who supported him, but as a person with power, agency, and the capacity to affect his life in ways he'd never imagined. His mouth opened and closed, searching for words. But Rachel had already turned her attention to Dr. Chin. Let's have this baby, she said. David stood frozen as nurses ushered him toward the door. Rachel could see his mind working, calculating what her revelation meant. How badly he'd miscalculated, but he didn't stay. He didn't suddenly transform into a decent man who'd realized he'd made a terrible mistake. Instead, he left, walking out of the delivery room while his wife prepared to push their daughter into the world. And Rachel understood that this was actually a gift. She was getting clarity, getting freedom, getting a clean break from a man who'd never deserved her. The next 40 minutes were a blur of pain, effort, and primal determination. Rachel pushed her daughter into the world with the same focused intensity she brought to everything else in her life. When the baby emerged crying imperfect, Dr. Chen placed her on Rachel's chest. And Rachel felt something shift inside her that was more fundamental than any business deal, any betrayal, any revenge plot. This was hers, her daughter, her life, her future, and David had chosen to miss it. What's her name? The nurse asked, preparing the birth certificate. Rachel had planned to name her Emma, a name she and David had agreed on, but David had forfeited his right to be part of that decision. Victoria, Rachel said instead. Victoria Elalina Montgomery. Not Montgomery, whatever David's last name would become after he married Vanessa. Just Montgomery, just hers. She held Victoria against her chest, studying her daughter's face, counting her fingers and toes, marveling at the reality of her. This tiny human had no idea that she'd been born into chaos. That her father had abandoned them both, that her mother was simultaneously the most vulnerable and most powerful she'd ever been. Victoria just breathed, existing purely in the moment, innocent of the adult disasters swirling around her. Rachel's phone buzzed again. Multiple messages flooding in as word spread about the Meridian acquisition. Congratulations from board members. Media requests for interviews, messages from colleagues who'd known her plan and were celebrating its success. Mixed in were texts from numbers she didn't recognize. Probably David's friends and family having heard something, reaching out for confirmation or explanation. She ignored them all and focused on Victoria's breathing, the tiny huffs and snuffles of a newborn, the weight of her in Rachel's arms. The private recovery room was quiet, except for Victoria's occasional squeaks and sighs. Rachel had been moved from the delivery room 2 hours ago, stitched and medicated, her body exhausted, but her mind alert and racing. She'd sent Jennifer, her assistant, a series of text instructions that would set Monday morning's events in motion. The press release about her new position at Meridian would drop at 8 a.m. The notification to David's supervisor about organizational restructuring would arrive at 8:15 a.m. And at 8:30 a.m., a memo would circulate announcing that the company was implementing a strict anti-fraternization policy effective immediately with retroactive reviews of any undisclosed relationships between employees. Rachel wasn't vindictive by nature, but she believed in consequences. David and Vanessa had made their choices, believing they operated in a world where Rachel was powerless to respond. They'd underestimated her completely, and now they would learn the cost of that miscalculation. Her mother-in-law, former mother-in-law, called at midnight. Margaret Montgomery had always been kind to Rachel, perhaps because Rachel had saved her life with that anonymous payment for experimental cancer treatment. Margaret didn't know about the treatment, just as David didn't know, just as no one knew about the many ways Rachel had quietly supported the people around her while building her empire in secret. Rachel, honey, David called me from Las Vegas. Margaret's voice was thick with emotion. He said, you two are separating. He's getting married to another woman. I'm so sorry. I'm so ashamed. Is the baby okay? Are you okay? Rachel looked down at Victoria, sleeping peacefully in the hospital bassinet. We're fine, Margaret. Better than fine, actually. What he did, leaving you in labor? Margaret's voice broke. I didn't raise him to be that kind of man. I don't know what happened to my son. Rachel could have told her what happened. David had always been that kind of man, selfish and small. But he'd hidden it better when Rachel was less successful, less threatening to his ego. Instead, she said, "You're welcome to visit us anytime. You're Victoria's grandmother." Nothing changes that. The generosity made Margaret cry harder. They talked for a few more minutes, Margaret apologizing repeatedly for her son's behavior, Rachel assuring her that Victoria would know her grandmother. When they hung up, Rachel felt the first real stirring of something beyond strategic planning. She felt the vast exhausting weight of having to be the bigger person. The one who made things work, the one who protected everyone else's feelings while her own were shredded. But she was good at being strong. She'd had decades of practice. Sunday morning arrived with harsh fluorescent light and the sound of hospital routines. Rachel fed Victoria, changed her, marveled at how something so small could be so complete, so perfect. Her body acted in ways she hadn't anticipated. A reminder that childbirth was trauma, no matter how clinical the setting. But the physical pain was manageable. It had edges, boundaries, medication that could dull it. The emotional pain was more complex, a shifting landscape that she'd have to learn to navigate. Jennifer arrived at 10 a.m. with a bag of clothes, toiletries, and Rachel's laptop. "You should be resting," Jennifer said. But she put the laptop on the bedside table anyway because she knew Rachel well enough to know that work was how she processed, how she controlled what she could control. "How's David?" Rachel asked. Because she needed to know. Needed to understand what her husband, her ex-husband she supposed, was doing in Vegas while their daughter learned to breathe outside the womb. Jennifer's expression was carefully neutral. Social media suggests he got married at the Bellagio at 11 p.m. last night. There are photos. Vanessa posted them. Of course, she did. Rachel could imagine the photos. David in a suit, Vanessa in white. Both of them looking triumphant, as if they'd won something. "Show me," she said. Jennifer hesitated, but Rachel insisted. She needed to see it. Needed to process the full reality of what David had chosen. The photos were exactly what she'd imagined, perfect. Staged, filtered to make everything look romantic and inevitable. Vanessa's caption read, "When you know, Mr. and Mrs. Montgomery, finally living our truth." Mrs. Montgomery. Vanessa had taken the name that Rachel still held. Would continue to hold legally until the divorce was finalized. The presumption of it, the audacity should have enraged Rachel. Instead, she felt a cold clarity settling over her. These people, these small-minded people who thought a wedding in Vegas and some Instagram photos constituted victory, had no idea what was coming. "Send flowers to their hotel room," Rachel instructed Jennifer. "Congratulations on your marriage. Include a note. Looking forward to working with both of you on Monday. Our Montgomery, CEO, Meridian Tech Holdings." Jennifer's smile was sharp and approving. "Anything else?" "Yes. Schedule an all-hands meeting for Monday at 2 p.m. I want to introduce myself to the company properly, make sure David and Vanessa are both required to attend." The pieces were moving into place. Rachel wasn't just responding to David's betrayal. She was crafting a response that would be measured, professional, and absolutely devastating. Rachel brought Victoria home on Monday morning to an apartment that felt simultaneously familiar and alien. David's things were still here. His clothes in the closet, his books on the shelves, his coffee mug in the kitchen sink. Evidence of a life he'd abandoned without even having the decency to pack properly. Rachel called a moving company and had them box everything up within 3 hours. David's belongings would be in a storage unit by evening. His key would no longer work. And the apartment, which Rachel had purchased under her corporate entity 2 years ago, another fact David had never known, would be solely hers. Margaret came over at noon to meet Victoria, bringing flowers and tears and apologies. They sat together on the Couch, Victoria sleeping between them, and didn't talk about David at all. Instead, Margaret told stories about her own mother, about the women in their family who'd survived worse, about the strength that seemed to run through the maternal line. It was a form of absolution, Margaret's way of saying that Rachel was the daughter she'd always wanted, that blood didn't matter as much as character. At 1:45 p.m., Rachel logged into the Meridian Tech Holdings virtual meeting platform. Her home office was tidy, professional, with Victoria sleeping in a bassinet just out of camera range. At 2 p.m. exactly, she unmuted herself and began, "Good afternoon. For those who don't know me, I'm Rachel Montgomery, and as of Friday, at 3:47 p.m., I became the majority shareholder and CEO of this company." She watched the participant count climb. 427 employees, all tuning in to meet their new boss. Somewhere in that list were David and Vanessa, probably watching from different locations now. Probably beginning to understand the magnitude of their situation. Rachel spoke for 20 minutes about her vision for the company, her commitment to excellence, her expectations for performance and integrity. She announced the new anti-fraternization policy, framing it as a matter of professional ethics and legal protection. She didn't mention David or Vanessa by name. Didn't need to. Everyone would understand the implications. As the meeting ended, Rachel received a call from an unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. "Rachel." David's voice was small, stripped of its usual confidence. "We need to talk about Victoria, about everything. I made a mistake." Rachel looked at her daughter, sleeping peacefully, oblivious to her father's regret. "You made a choice," she corrected. "And now you get to live with the consequences. My lawyer will contact you about custody arrangements. All other communication goes through HR regarding your employment status. We're done, David." She hung up before he could respond, before he could try to negotiate or manipulate or do any of the things he'd always done. The phone rang again immediately, but Rachel didn't answer. Instead, she picked up Victoria, held her daughter close, and looked out the window at the city that had watched her rise from nothing to everything. The shock on David's face, she could imagine it perfectly. The moment he'd realized that the wife he'd abandoned wasn't broken or helpless, but powerful and unshakable. That shock would fade eventually, replaced by regret, anger, resignation. But Rachel's power wouldn't fade. Neither would Victoria's inheritance. The company Rachel was building not just for herself, but for her daughter. A legacy of strength and strategic brilliance that no man could diminish or destroy. She'd been abandoned in a delivery room by a man who'd never deserved her. But she'd delivered herself and her daughter into a future where they would never depend on anyone else's mercy, anyone else's love, anyone else's small vision of what they could become. And that Rachel thought was shock enough for anyone.